Jaskin and Mitchell's material bit by bit, arguing why Michael has in fact already answered those points and acknowledging when those points were ignored. First, regulation, then inefficiency and the harms of these banks' actions, and then cronyism and corruption. First, though, I want to respond to Dan's POI, because the distinction between Goldman Sachs and McDonald's, while not something I ever had to clarify in a debate, is twofold. Firstly, we think McDonald's don't control the food supply, right? It is just trivially true that these banks have such a huge influence on the money supply of an economy and have such a perverse influence on that the effect of those banks failing is much more than the effect of McDonald's. But moreover, we question why is it that McDonald's is likely to not need to be bailed out by the state. It's because, like, systemically important companies that deal in things like food don't tend to fail if they are reasonably successful, because the market that they're functioning in relies on consumers like consenting to buy their products when they choose to do so, rather than speculating on products that literally aren't even products to a large extent. The average reasonable voter does not understand what banks are even doing half of the time. So McDonald's is a lot more stable as an institution than Goldman Sachs for various reasons, right? Regulation, right? Firstly, like, opening up can't just say, we want all the kinds of good regulation that will do everything Prop want without any of their harms, and then debate over, right? Like, the problem is that Michael literally told you in his speech why regulations are either not likely to happen in the first place or likely to be repealed. Glass-Steagall was repealed. They can't just say, we wouldn't repeal it, because that doesn't count as an argument, right? The reason that they always will be repealed is that these lobbyists have an incredible amount of power, like, even within state institutions. The Fed chair currently of the United States was on the board of Goldman Sachs. It is incredibly unlikely that the state will ever choose to listen to these central policies instead of these banks. We think, moreover, like, even if they say, oh, but we can break them up so that they don't become that, so that we take away their influence. This is a weirdly circular argument, because at the point where they have become powerful enough that they have that kind of influence, breaking them up is also something that takes an incredible amount of political capital. Moreover, we say our policy disincentivizes the creation of massive banks that are too big to fail, so we think it's a double win for us, right? Point two, inefficiency. They say it's bad for economic development because investors won't want to invest in these kind of banks. Maybe that was true before the year 2007, but the fact is that nowadays, now that investors now understand the perverse power that the global banking system has on the economy, their likelihood to fail, and they're likely to massively screw up every world economy when they do so, investors are just as likely to invest in things like government bonds of stable states, right? Because they know that those are better investments. They're also more likely to, for example, invest in McDonald's or whatever, right? So we think that in this case, we think that investors might be likely to take a smaller return on a much more stable investment in the same way that they might invest in a government bond. Then they say, oh, but like, your risk averseness is bad because risk encouraging behavior is good for the economy and is good for economic development. That's true to a certain extent, and we are happy for these government-run banks to take risks to a certain extent. Why will they, though, and why are they structurally likely to do so? Because as Michael told you, and it wasn't responded to, governments see the economy as a whole and see the economy as a whole being good for them. This means they're likely to pursue policies that are risky, but also that are popular and that people want. For example, housing, which is a risky market that banks are incredibly unlikely at the moment to want to invest in, because it's something that doesn't necessarily get the biggest return for them and is quite risky, right? The kinds of risks that we don't think they're likely to take are speculation on futures of agricultural products, which are literally not actual things and don't contribute to the daily lives of people in any meaningful way. That is what we mean by risk averse. We still think these banks will take risks to a certain extent, but we also think that they will, be likely to not take the worst risks that banks take. But why is that true? Why is the comparative better on our side of the house, right? No thanks. Because the reason that banks take these risks is because of the moral hazard factor that Michael explained to you. The fact is, the comparative, in this debate, is not states not being involved in banking at all versus states being really involved in banking. States in the status quo are incredibly involved in banking because when banks that are too big to fail, they get bailed out. So states are inherently really involved in all the bad parts of banking, taking on all of their debt, taking on all of their failure. Which means that because banks like Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers know that that is the case and know that they are so integrated into the economy that the state will bail them out, that means they are likely to be so risk averse in economies that don't manage the daily lives of people, besides from things like housing, but more like things like futures and things like that. That is the risk averse behaviour that we would like to correct for. The government already takes on the risks of banks, but it doesn't take on any of the benefits, like for example the profits that they could use to put into the government budget and actually help people down.
So, under your world, who do you think is going to run the big banks and why? Individually.
Individually. Probably people who get hired because of qualifications like civil servants and people who work in the NHS. I don't really understand what that point was supposed to be about, but I'll POI you on it later when I do. Right? We also think that the state, as Michael explained to you, and again it wasn't responded to, that states are less likely to do things that are just bad for people, for the economy as a whole, and bad for individual people, like foreclosing houses and calling in all your mortgages at the same time, because that wrecks the housing economy and doesn't do anything for the economy as a whole, but allows those partners to get all their assets, transfer them to their partners, and declare bankruptcy. Third, cronyism and corruption. Like, it is much easier to call out cronyism and corruption in an industry when the government is involved in it in name, as well as just collecting all the debt and being the guarantor for that debt afterwards. Like, I said the thing about the Fed chair was on the board of Goldman Sachs, and no one says anything about that now. But on the political stuff that Jasmine brings us about, about the fact that they'll bring unfair policies like Bhumi-Putra into banking. The problem is that if they want regulation, it is likely that if a state is this corrupt or this unfair on its citizens, that those are the kinds of regulations that they will put into banking, particularly if they're like a right-wing populist party whose citizens want them to do that anyway. We don't think that it is an exclusive harm for our side. It'll probably happen on both sides, if it would happen at all. We think that it is an injustice that banks are able to control the economy and the state has no say. We are so very proud to oppose.